I'm Danielle Jorlet, corporate reporter at PRWeek. Today I'm with Robert Fronk from Harris Interactive. Earlier this month, results were released from their U.S. reputation survey. You know, if you could tell us a little bit about the survey and who ended up on top this year.
Sure. So this is the 12th annual study of the reputation quotient. And this year, of the most visible companies in the United States, Google came out on top, which was not a surprise. Google has been a top-performing company in our study for the past couple of years. But what is interesting, I think, two things about Google being there. One, they are certainly the youngest company to ever sit in that top spot.
Okay.
And secondly, I think the characteristics of reputation that drove them to that top spot are different than some of the other leaders we've seen in the past. In the past, we've seen things like the quality of the products or emotional appeal really drive strong reputations. And for Google, it's actually more about its financial performance, its vision and leadership, and its perceptions as a great employer.
Great. And was there, you know, any sort of a sticking point or something that really struck you from these results?
Yeah, so there were, first of all, it was interesting to see the same four companies at the top just reorder themselves this year. So you had Google #1, Johnson & Johnson, 3M, and then Berkshire Hathaway, and they just reordered themselves. So the same four companies from 2010 were there in 2011. And the two things I think, though, that really jumped out in this year's study were first and foremost the number of companies that achieved excellent reputation scores. In the previous 11 years of the study, the highest number of companies that had ever achieved an RQ score of 80, which is an indication of an excellent reputation, was 6. This year we had 16. And in addition to the number of companies, the characteristics of reputation that separated those 16 from the rest of the pack were uniquely different than what we've seen in the past. Those two characteristics were corporate performance, so actually doing well in your business, and then the second was but doing it with an ethical framework. And that's a very different sort of foundation for reputation this year, and it really jumped out at us because it really separates, sort of in some ways contextualizes where the general public is setting some of their expectations for companies.
Great. Now, is there a particular market sector that seems to be doing specifically well with reputation?
Yeah, so the technology industry has just some built-in advantages and has always had the highest reputation as an industry. If you think about what they offer to the general public, innovation, products that make you more efficient, products that enrich or entertain you, their business model is almost built towards having positive reputation, and it's one of the few industries where actually failing isn't seen as a bad thing because of that drive for innovation. So at the positive end, the technology companies really, really are still the reputation elite. We saw the biggest jumps in the study this year come in the auto industry, where the auto industry, particularly U.S. auto manufacturers, have really climbed out of a long slide, and this year moved them back very much into a more stable place for reputation. So all of the auto companies, with the exception of Toyota, saw great gains in their reputation.
Is there a sector that's struggling at all that you saw?
There is one that's struggling, and it's struggling not just from a sort of any sort of a long-standing perspective. In many ways, our respondents in the study this year made clear to us that they felt this industry put itself into this negative position, and that's the financial services industry. And if you think back to the two things I mentioned just a few moments ago that separated the elite from the rest of the pack, was performance, actually managing your business well and doing so with an ethical framework. Right now, the general public sees those as actually the two greatest gaps that the financial services companies need to overcome.
Great. And you've been doing the survey. This is the 12th year that you've been doing this.
That's correct.
Are there any trends you've seen, or how is it different from that first year when you guys did it?
Yeah, so, early on when we began building this model for reputation, the reputation quotient is, by the way, it's a model of 6 dimensions of reputation. We have found over this 12 years of time that the dimensions of reputation themselves have not changed, but the framework and how they order themselves and how the general public views companies, the lens has changed. In what I'll call maybe sort of version 1 of reputation, it was very much this notion of products and services were really what people thought of first when they thought of reputation. And that goes back 10, 12 years ago. Version 2 is when vision and leadership began to be a little bit more primary. in separating companies with good reputations. And then version 3 are the two things that I mentioned earlier. It's now more about corporate performance and the way in which you conduct your business. And so we've seen that trend, and each of those have lasted about 4 years, and this new one is now 2 years in, and we'll see what that does. I think the second, and then around those changes, there's always those foundational elements of trust, admiration, and respect. So if you don't get over the hurdle of being perceived positively on those 3, you actually can't get credit for any of the other dimensions. So that's very much been a foundational part of this. The second thing that we've seen in terms of great change, and this is probably quite relevant to your readership, is that we have seen communications and the perceptions of communication style and approaches having a higher and higher correlation with reputation. In particular, companies that are perceived to communicate sincerely, honestly, and seek transparency are correlated with those companies that have the highest reputations.
I guess branching on from that, now that these results have come out, what can corporate communications professionals and PR professionals at agencies, how can they take these results and put it to work?
I've seen your magazine many times talk about how the outcome of great public relations or great corporate communications work is strong reputation, and I agree wholly with that principle. And given that that's the main objective and sort of equity that you're trying to build, or these professionals are building for their clients, there are a couple of things that the study suggests. One is to stop focusing on the immediate, the here and the now, in terms of how do I do better on this list? How can I go about getting a better score? How can I find a silver bullet? What's the one thing? I'm asked frequently, just tell me the one thing I need to do. And of course the answer is there isn't a one thing that you need to do. Reputation is just far more multidimensional than that. So I would suggest to professionals to think about this much the same way you think you build long-term equity in anything, is invest in both the things you need to do now, but always with an eye toward it being the right thing in the long term. Don't think of it almost as sort of the quarterly financial statement where I have to goose the numbers to look good now for Wall Street. Reputation management is really about building long-term equity.
Great. Now, in addition to releasing these results earlier this month, I think it was this week or last week, Harris launched a mobile app. Is this the first time? What is this about?
Yeah, so at the end of last week, Harris, which is very much credited with having moved market research from telephone and mall intercepts to the internet almost 15 years ago, has now also the first company to create mobile applications for research on all 3 of the major mobile platforms. So both Apple, Android, and BlackBerry, the RIM platform, we actually can now conduct market research on those mobile platforms. We're very excited about it. It may be one of sort of that next phase of research. And the real benefits of the mobile platforms is that it allows us to actually reach many hard-to-reach audiences who are not sitting and waiting to be researched. And so you've got Gen Y, you've got moms on the go in the business-to-business or professional space, you've got physicians. So it really gives us another platform to best understand the audiences that our clients are most interested in understanding.
Great. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.